So as you're inspired, let's talk about the labor shortage in the energy markets, particularly in the utilities, oil and gas, and renewables. There's several factors. The workforce is aging. There's a need to diversify the management that represents different perspectives. And gender is an obvious differentiator, but so is age, educational attainment, race, and nationality. So it's no secret that women are underrepresented in the energy industry. And according to the DOE, Department of Energy, less than a quarter of the US workers in the electric power generation field are women. This is compared to an average of almost 47% of women in the national workforce. The DOE's latest US Energy and Employment Report covers 4 sectors of the U.S. economy. They covered the electric power generation and fuel sector, the transmission, distribution, and storage sector, the energy efficiency sector, and the motor vehicles sector. The report found that these energy-related sectors are relatively less diverse compared to the overall national workforce. And I remember back in my 20s when I had a company, I always wondered and was perplexed as to how I was supposed to act and what I was supposed to do. And I quickly learned that we need to be credible, reliable, trustworthy, smart, better, that kind of thing. But that is for men and for women. So in this session today, we'll be talking about the stories of the women and how they got there. Just yesterday, I was reading a story of an accomplished woman in oil and gas. I really strongly agreed with many of her points of how important it is for women in a male-dominated career. And this is what she talked about, that we're responsible as women to nurture our own inner self-reliance and determination, just as the pioneering women had to do when they helped settle America. She shared about using humor in difficult times, which has helped to disarm negative reactions. And she also talked about not taking things personally and not being easily offended. Navigating through the barriers and the challenges is a critical skill that women need to learn. Learning from mentors is very valuable, and so I encourage, especially the young women, to take time to have male and female mentors that really help you navigate. As the energy industries are transitioning, so is the need for a diverse set of opinions, ideas at the upper level, management level, in order to rise to the challenges facing this world. And having women in those leadership roles will be key. So I expect you're going to be fascinated by the stories of the women that are going to be on stage here very shortly. And I expect that they probably agree with me that we have an obligation to the younger women to make sure that we don't pull the ladder up behind us. So please let me start by introducing our moderator, Bobby Garrett. Bobby is currently the Deputy Lab Director and Chief Operating Officer at National Renewable Energy Laboratory, one of the 17 in the country. Bobby's career has spanned multiple important duties since joining NREL since 1998. So please help me give a warm welcome to Bobby Garrett.
Thank you, Maury. The way that I'm going to call the other panelists up at this point, we've got Ann Halloran, who's the Senior Manager for Renewable Energy Technologies at the Sandia National Laboratory. Kathy Woolham, Senior Vice President, Environmental Services and Chief Environmental Counsel at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And Laura Nelson, Utah Governor's Energy Office Advisor. I'm delighted to be here today, in part because I'm really eager to hear the stories and the career paths of each of these very accomplished women. The way that we're going to manage the panel today, as each of us will share our stories. What career paths did we take that brought us to the roles that we play today? And in the process, share with you perhaps some surprises along the way, as well as some advice going forward. And then in my role as chair of the panel, I'm going to take the prerogative to ask a few questions of my fellow panelists. And then we'll open it up for audience questions. So get ready for your questions. I'm going to start by sharing my career path with you. And I'd like to be able to say that I started out of college with a focus on clean energy, and I had a linear path and a strategy to get there. But that was truly not the case. When I graduated as a chemical engineer, Montana State University, I was trained to work in a petroleum refinery or in a chemical plant. And clean energy wasn't even part of the vernacular at that point in time. And I think I've always been a rebel somewhat. I was the youngest of 3 daughters. I always followed my dad around, had my head under the hood of the car, always wanted to know how things worked. But when I got those job offers from the petroleum industry, and believe me, they were the highest paying offers at the time, what I chose to do instead was go and work on nuclear waste management. And the reason I did that, and I don't know that I had the self-awareness at the time to be able to say this, but I do now, was because it was the path less traveled. It was the one where I didn't know anything about it, and it was an opportunity to learn. And so I went to work for a company of 12,000 people. They had 3 women engineers. The vast majority of the employees were in the trades and crafts, and they were nuclear operators. They were a unionized workforce. And it was probably one of the biggest growth experiences I had because it taught me how to work with a wide variety of people and how to communicate. And the most important thing I learned in communication was how to listen and how to ask questions and how to learn from everybody that you encounter. It was a tremendous experience. But after 2 years, I felt like I was in a career cul-de-sac. I wasn't learning anything new, and I was kind of having one day that looked like the next day. And so I started to look around, and I considered several options at that point, but one that attracted my attention was the Department of Energy National Laboratory that was also located in the same place where I was currently working. And I'd had the opportunity to work with some of the research scientists in my role in waste management. Plus, when they gave me the job offer, it came with an opportunity in the first year of employment to rotate through the company on 4 different assignments to find the right fit. And that sounded like a good thing to me because I still wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. After 2 rotations, I said, stop, I want to stay where I'm at because it was the leading edge of the startup of research in renewable energy in the country. It was during the time of President Carter's administration, energy independence, and a large federal investment was going into all forms of renewable energy. It was an extremely exciting time. And so my career in clean energy started at that point, but it wasn't linear from there. Over the next 20 years at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, I had the opportunity to work not only in energy research on clean energy, but fossil energy, nuclear energy, environmental issues, both local air quality, waste management, global climate change issues. Probably the biggest departure I took was to manage a group around medical energy, and this was a surprise. I was called in one day, we're in the midst of a reorganization, and the person who was going to become my boss said, Garrett, you can have your choice of 5 business areas. And so I started down the list and I said, energy, I've been doing that. No, I don't want you to do that. Well, I got to the 5th one, which was medical. I'd never done anything in the medical area, and I said, you can't really be serious. You want me to manage the medical research area? And the answer was, yes, I want you to do that. And so there was a moment of hesitation, and then I leapt in, and I said, okay, I'll do that. And this has been a pattern in my life. I had buyer's regret. It's like, why did I say that? I panicked. I thought I had to know everything on day one. I found out that there were very competent people I was working with, and what I helped bring to the party was the ability, again, to listen and hear, understand where they wanted to go, help them create a vision, learn the business, and know who to rely on that really had the deep understanding. But it was an extremely rewarding career opportunity for me. And I guess my lesson learned from that is when you have the biggest stretch assignments, when you're well outside your comfort zone, that's when you learn the most. And that's when you take the biggest leaps forward in your career. So don't hesitate to take a risk. So then, after 20 years at Pacific Northwest, I had so much variety in my career. I thought it was going to be my career for life. I married, had 3 children, had a great network in the community, lots of friends. And going to work one day, I got a message, you need to get to the director's office right now. And I got in my car and I'm thinking, what have I done? Couldn't imagine what it was, but it was such an urgent message. And I got there, and the question I was asked was the following. It was, again, Garrett, I need your help. The person that we sent down to work with MRI Global on the recompetition to manage the National Renewable Laboratory is not working out. There's not good chemistry in the team, and you need to help me decide who's going to go down there. And then the magic words were said, and I can still feel exactly my response today. The magic words were, and I know you don't want to go. And my hands went on my hips, and I said, why would you make that assumption? The next day I was on the airplane. And 6 months later, my family moved in to join me. And I've been at the National Renewable Laboratory now for 18 years. It was an unexpected career move. It was a jump in. It absolutely aligns with my passion. It got me back to energy at a time when I wasn't working on energy at that laboratory. It was still in a research environment, which I recognize I need because every day is different than the day before. But it wasn't the end of the surprises in my career. So about 2.5 years ago, the chair of our board came to me. I don't know why people call me Garrett, but I don't mind. He said, Garrett, you can throw your hat in the ring to become the next director of the National Renewable Laboratory, or you can lead the search committee. Which one do you want? And I didn't hesitate, because at that point I knew enough about myself to know what I like to do, and I said, I want to lead the search committee. And it was extremely rewarding to do that, to be able to present the slate of candidates after interviewing just amazing people to our board. They made the selection, but that wasn't the end of the surprises. The new director, after 2 months, came to me and said, I want you to take a different role in the laboratory. I want you to become the chief operating officer of the lab. And I said, you want me to do what? You know, I didn't come up through operations. I've been in research my entire career. I'd been managing all of the external functions of the laboratory, technology transfer, business and market development, all the work that we do all over the world, helping people implement energy projects and our energy analysis capability. And I said, this is really, you're kind of crazy. If you want me to do this, I won't be the traditional COO. And he said, that's why I want you to do it. Because this is about culture change, and this is about making sure that all of our operations are supportive of research, and we need somebody that understands research to take that on. So that's the journey I've been on over the last couple of years, and it's been extremely rewarding. So that's kind of my career path. I guess what I would leave with those of you that are entering clean energy now is don't be afraid to take risks. Again, those stretch assignments and those opportunities to learn are when you're going to make the biggest career advances. I'd also say if there's an opportunity for further education, take it every chance you get. If your company provides support for advanced education, take advantage of that, but take advantage of the informal learning as well by taking new assignments within your company or within your role, or by learning on the side. That will serve you well throughout your career. And with that, I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Bobby. Good morning, I'm Amy Halloran. I work at Sandia National Labs. I head up our renewable energy R&D program. And like Bobby, I didn't go there directly. In fact, I had a even less direct course, but I was a chemical engineer. I went to Virginia Tech for my undergrad. I decided to be an engineer because, like probably many of you in the room, I was good at math and science. I loved Legos. Putting things together, Tinker toys, whatever it was. I liked to build things. I helped my dad work on our cars. There was nobody in my family who had been an engineer other than a great-grandfather who had been the kind of engineer who drove trains. So I didn't really have a role model there. I picked chemical engineering because I had a fabulous 10th grade chemistry teacher, and she really inspired me in chemistry, and I still love chemistry. So I went to Virginia Tech. I struggled my first 2 years because, as many engineers are, I'm very applied. I was taking Laplace transforms, and I couldn't figure out how was I going to use this. And that was mostly because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got out of school. At that time, again, most chemical engineers went into either the petroleum industry or worked for Dow or Union Carbide in the chemical industry, and that's not really what I saw myself doing. So I started talking to professors and saying, well, what else can I do with a chemical engineering degree? And one of them offered me some to work on some of his research in water treatment and wastewater treatment. He was developing new processes for that, and it really inspired me. And I decided, wow, this is what I want to do. Now I can see it. And I started taking classes in the civil engineering department, which is where at Virginia Tech they have environmental engineering. And I found it was a great fit because I knew chemistry and the civil engineers didn't. So it was really nice. And through that professor, I went to grad school at University of Illinois because he knew a professor there who had also written my water chemistry book. And I got a master's in environmental engineering there. And then from that, I went to private industry to CH2M Hill, where I worked for 22 years, working on Superfund sites. Superfund had been passed through CERCLA in 1980. I went to school in the early 80s, and so it was a new industry, and I could really see that I was making an impact, and that was important to me, investigating and cleaning up Superfund sites across the country, whether they were contaminated groundwater or contaminated soils. One thing that I learned early on in my career, and what I think has really helped me advance, is that you can complain about things, but you have to be willing to put up your hand and say, I want to help fix these things. So whether it's, CH2M Hill was a big bureaucratic organization, so there was a lot of bureaucracy that the staff had to deal with. And so I would complain about something, but then offer to say, hey, I'd like to take this and work on it so that we could have a more streamlined process. So I'll throw that out there to you guys who are students or starting your careers. That's really important. Don't be seen as a complainer. Be seen as somebody who can help impact things. Another thing that really helped me in my career was when I was an undergrad, I got a minor in English, I got a minor in biology, I took Russian history, I took French. It took me forever to get out of school. I went for 5 years plus every summer. I had so many credits, they were getting ready to throw me out. But I do think that that is what has made me successful in my career. I rely as much on my communication skills, my ability to write that I developed in English. I have a more interesting life because I know Russian history. For the undergraduates in the room, you're at a university, take advantage of it. You're not at just a technical school. You never know where your career is going to take you. After 22 years of working at CH2M Hill, I had kind of plateaued. I needed to move on. I could have gone to corporate, except for I had a husband and 2 children. One of the children is here in the room today. She's a first-year senior in chemical engineering here. And I wasn't able, yay, Katie. I wasn't able to move, and so I was having Christmas dinner with a friend of mine, and she worked at Sandia National Labs and said, wow, have I got the job for you? Come manage our atmospheric science and geophysics programs. And so that sounded really interesting to me. I wasn't sure how my past career would apply, but I decided to try. Let's try something new. And it really did apply, and I found that you can be successful. If you're successful in one organization, you can bring those skills to another one. And I really enjoyed the work that I did there. For the first 6 years, I managed a group that did climate research. We ran, or continue to run, 2 research stations on the North Slope of Alaska collecting climate data. My geophysicists do everything from determining whether the last bomb went off, whether that was a bomb or whether it was an earthquake, to working in the oil and gas industry to improve how we do extraction and make that safer. But I really got passionate about the work in the Arctic. And in the 6 years that I ran that department, you could see the changes physically that were happening there. We were there one summer when you needed air conditioning, and this is above the Arctic Circle. It was so hot, and it had never been that warm before. We are located on an Air Force station, and every year they're having to rebuild the road that goes to the Air Force station because it is eroding away at an alarming rate. It eroded in 5 years what they had predicted it would do in 50 years. So you can really see climate change happening on the North Slope of Alaska. And that led me to my current job, which is managing renewable energy R&D, because I am very passionate that that is going to help us fix the climate issues that we have today. So not a very direct path, and got a lot of help along the way, asked for help, just like I asked those professors, what do students do when they graduate here? What can I do? I've always been not shy about asking people I'm working with for mentorship. I've had a lot of mentors who have helped me along the way, both men and women. I think you can learn equally well from either one, and they can bring different perspectives to you. So that's sort of my story. Thank you.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Kathy Willems, I'm the Senior Vice President of Environmental and Chief Environmental Counsel for Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And that is one of the longest titles we have in our organization. I, unlike our previous two panelists, have no expertise in math and science. I went a completely different direction. So by training, I'm a lawyer. My undergraduate degree is in political science. I had a minor in English. So how do I end up in an organization that has aggressively pursued renewable energy? Frankly, a lot of it was by luck and by being in the right place at the right time. I didn't have a whole lot of leadership coming from within my family. I was the first one to go to college. So I remember very vividly having a conversation at dinner time with my parents saying, hey, I want to go to college and I want to be a history teacher. And they looked at me, you know, the deer in the headlights look, and said, oh, good luck with that. And needless to say, my emphasis changed from history to political science. And I was one of those, while I was a student, one of those students who flipped my major back and forth, public administration, political science, what do I do? What do I want to do when I grow up? I'm still not sure I know the answer to that, but I seem to have found a reasonable career path. And coming out of undergrad with a political science degree, I went to DC first and worked out there for a time, and then went back to, at the time I lived in Wisconsin, went back to the state and worked for 2 state representatives. When I was in Congress, supporting a congressman, he was a Democrat. I came back and worked for 2 state Republicans. It gave me enough idea of diversity to say, I think I want to go to law school and not be in this political realm. So that's what I did. I had about a year off before I went to law school. I went to law school at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, and at that time, there literally were no environmental law classes. The most we had to offer there was an oil and gas course, and about 7 students a year took that course. I was not one of them. It was largely students who were from Texas and wanted to go back to Texas and, you know, practice in oil and gas. Well, that wasn't my thing, and I thought I wanted to be a litigator, and I became a litigator. I remember that when we had like mock trial and moot court arguments, I started winning some of these competitions, and I would call up my dad and say, hey, remember when you told me it was always my mouth that got me in trouble? Well, guess what? It's starting to pay off. So I got out of law school, did a clerkship first. So I worked for district court judges. for a year and got some really great experience, knowing the inner workings of a courtroom. And then I went to a private law firm that was very small. It was a grandfather, father, son, another attorney, and me. And I was the first and only woman attorney that they ever hired. I had the opportunity to really hone my litigation skills because they focused on business, more business corporation type work, articles of incorporation. But we represented the local hospital, and the hospital got sued every once in a while. So I got really good experience really early on. But I also realized that I wasn't a family member, wasn't going to become a family member, and so I needed to start to kind of expand my search for other opportunities. But living in a smaller community, those opportunities sometimes aren't very easy to come by. So I got a call from a friend one day who said, hey, I applied for this position and interviewed for it, but it's not my thing. It might interest you. And it was a small electric and gas utility called Iowa-Illinois Gas and Electric. Had very small service territory in the state of Iowa and a little bit over in Illinois. And I thought, well, what the heck, I'm not going anywhere here, and I love the courtroom, but I interviewed after about an 8-hour interview, and ultimately, yes, an 8-hour interview, ultimately was hired. And I also had this other little complication that came my way in the interim, because between the time I interviewed and the time I was offered the position, I found out I was pregnant with my first child. So imagine having to, when you get the call offering you the job, to say, oh, by the way, I'm going to need a little time off. It's a few months from now, so we're okay. Luckily, I had very insightful leaders at that time, and the general counsel said, because I was going into the legal department, said, no problem, we'll accommodate that, and here's your scope of responsibilities. So I did claim supervision, litigation. We were bringing a lot of our cases internal, trying to cut down outside counsel costs, and oh, by the way, that's environmental too. And environmental will take up about 5% of your time. So the new person always got the environmental stuff. Well, 5% of my time rapidly grew to about 105% of my time as we had a major piece of litigation filed against us that involved a contaminated site that we were in the historic chain of title. So I got my real education on environmental and sort of renewable issues on the job. Because all of a sudden I had a Superfund site to deal with. And it was also at a time where, because the state of Iowa being one of the first states to have what was then called an alternative energy standard in 1983, it had started to become implementational in the early 90s. We started to look at what are we going to do to meet this renewable requirement, which at that time was 105 megawatts. Today, it's still 105 megawatts, and our company will, by the end of 2020, have about 6,000 megawatts of renewable generation located just in the state of Iowa. So, we started small, but because of a lot of advantages in the state, because of the resource base, because of tax credits, and because of enlightened leadership, we were able to expand that renewable portfolio very, very significantly. So one major thing happened back in 1995, which was we became merged with another company. And of course, it was at the time where a lot of utility consolidation was going on, and we did this horrible process called an open application process. Everybody in the company had to reapply for jobs, even your own, and it was a way to kind of shake things up, and not necessarily a bad way, although everybody grumbled about it, but it was a way to give people new opportunities. So I knew that the legal department was downsizing a bit from 2 separate companies and the total number of attorneys. So I just thought, well, I've been doing this environmental stuff for a while. I think I'll put my hat in the ring for the environmental manager's position. And so there were already 2 incumbents. So I thought my chances were slim, but at least I'd, give it a shot. And I got that position. And so many mergers, acquisitions, expansions later, the scope of my responsibilities has expanded very dramatically. I've got both a legal piece as well as sort of the day-to-day compliance piece, the environmental audit program, the policy and strategy. So my pie expanded very, very significantly, but nonetheless, still dealing with some of the same cases, it seems, that I did when I first joined the company almost 27 years ago. So I guess to a certain extent, my career path was accidental, but like some of the other ladies here, focusing on strengths, taking leaps, trusting your gut, I think all played a role in that. And certainly, and I would echo Amy's commentary on communication skills. Having an English background, having a political science degree helped tremendously in both communicating verbally as well as in writing, because you can put a lot of words on a paper, but if they don't mean anything to other people, obviously there are significant issues there. So I think also asking a lot of questions, especially if you don't know something. I have never been shy about asking questions, and a lot of people preface, you might think this is a stupid question or a dumb question or whatever. Well, if we don't ask the questions, we're never going to know if it's stupid or not, number one. And number two, we're never going to know the answer to those, because the likelihood of the answer just sort of evolving, I think, is limited. So with that, I will stop and we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Laura Nelson, and I am Governor Herbert's Energy Advisor in Utah. And in that role, I also serve as the Executive Director of his Office of Energy Development. And maybe as I go through my career, I'll talk about how I arrived at this position. But boy, it's quite an honor to follow these very esteemed women and to be with all of you here today. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. And I won't start when I was born, but I'll start when I was 9. And as you might pick up, I grew up in the South because that was an important turning point for me. Unlike Kathy, I was second generation to get an advanced degree. My parents were the first. And my dad, I think much to my chagrin, was a mathematician. And my mom was a nurse, ultimately getting a PhD in nursing. But when I was 9 years old, my dad decided that it was about time for me to get my full geometry, trigonometry, algebra, calculus underway. And I decided I liked none of those things. Of course, I had to continue to do them all. As a trade-off, when I was 12, I approached my parents about something that might entertain me a bit more. Could I please go to theater school? I'd like to be an actress. And I was from a family of 6 kids. We all got to do one sort of fun thing. For my brothers, it was ballet. If that tells you anything. So anyway, I got to go to theater school from the time I was 12 until I graduated from high school. I loved it, loved everything about it. It was a lot of fun. I love singing, even though I can't sing worth a darn. But I would do it all the time because I was going to make it. And another important thing happened when I was 12. We took our first family vacation out west. And we went to the Grand Canyon. And we stayed in one of those old hotels, motels along the highway. And, you know, we could hike around. This was before the day when you had to have a permit. And it was just wonderful. I thought, this is so beautiful. There can't be any more beautiful place in the world. And then we drove up into Utah, and we went to some of the national parks. And 2 weeks on the road with his 6 kids, my dad still hadn't had enough. And he said, well, let's go all the way to Salt Lake City. We've come this far. So we spent another week, and we went up along the Wasatch Front. And again, I just thought, this is so beautiful. When I grow up, this is where I'm going to live. So at 18 years old, I told my parents, I'm going away to be an actress, and I'm only applying to one school, the University of Utah. Fortunately, I did get in, and at the time, they only took 32 or 33 students. So I felt rewarded. I felt pleased I got in. And I was asked by my parents, do you have a backup plan? And I said, oh, of course. Yeah, if that doesn't work out, I'll become a mathematician. So a year into theater school, believe it or not, I was done. I felt like this really isn't for me. I wanted to do something different. And I was very enticed by the study of economics, the study of behavior. And the nice thing about it was it applied math. So I started about pursuing my interest in economics. At the same time, I did what you've heard from many of the other panelists up here. I started taking other classes that I found interesting. And that's the great thing about college. You may walk in with an idea of exactly what you're going to do, but it is the greatest opportunity to explore. And so I really got into American history and the history of Western Europe. I got into, business and accounting. I took some classes, but ultimately I found my passion in my environmental economics course. At the time, there were only like 2 environmental economics courses offered at the University of Utah. Well, when I finally completed my undergraduate degree in economics, I was set on going to law school, and I was going to study environmental law. And I figured the law school would have a few more classes in environmental issues than in economics. Well, as it turned out, some faculty approached me and said, Laura, we really think you should consider getting your PhD in economics. This was a week before I was supposed to take my LSAT. I said, I'm never going to do that. And they said, yes, you are. And so I went, instead of taking my LSAT, I went and studied for 16 hours and took my GRE and found out during that time that I was actually pregnant. So I was taking my GRE while I was pregnant with my first child. Fortunately, it worked out. I got into the PhD program. Again, wanted to study environmental economics, not a program. So I was told that if, in fact, I could get enough students interested in taking courses, which was about 5 or 6 students, that they could create a program around environmental and natural resource economics, which did occur. And so effectively, I ended up getting my PhD in environmental economics. And probably the most interesting thing for me was I really thought I was studying environmental economics. And I'm an energy advisor. Well, along the way, there was this recognition that it's all really the same. When we look at our natural resources and the quality of life that we enjoy, it's our environment that brings those things to us. So it seemed to be a natural transition to get into energy. So as I moved into teaching economics, I really encouraged my students to understand the role that natural resource development, that energy decisions played on environmental outcomes. And how could we make the best, most efficient decisions? In other words, how could we optimally realize the development of our resources while we also maintained our other core values around our environment and our culture? And I think that that's really important to understand. And so after I received my PhD, I did teach for 5 years in academics. In fact, I taught here in Colorado for a couple of years in Gunnison, Colorado, another beautiful place if you've not been there. But I had the opportunity to go back and teach at the University of Utah and further develop the environmental economics program. But I really felt like a real focus on energy was calling me. So I went into doing some consulting in the energy space, specifically in energy regulation, in fact, regulating the utility. My first case was a depreciation case, but that wasn't enough to deter me. So I continued along that path for quite some time, ultimately going to work in Idaho for the Idaho Public Service Commission as an advisor. And I thought that was the best job I'd ever had in my life. I got to look at all of these energy issues, the nexus of the utility issues with all of the other energy decisions that we have to make, whether it's how we use energy, how we produce energy, how we move energy. I was in love with my job and with energy and never felt more passionate. When I got a call from Utah, from Governor Huntsman, now Ambassador Huntsman, who asked if I would come back and be his energy advisor. Completely unexpected. I felt quite settled in Idaho. My daughter was just about to go into high school, and I didn't really feel like I was ready to make the transition. So I said, well, I really need to think about it, and I think I got 24 hours. And of course, you know, I took the position, and I thought it was going to be really challenging because it was going to cause me to be really outside of the box where I had gotten really comfortable. I felt really knowledgeable in what I was doing, but there was still enough space to challenge myself to going into an area where it was going to require me to expand my understanding of, you know, solar energy development, of, you know, fracking, of oil drilling and natural gas exploration, and all of the federal permitting and other things that went along with that. But I did it. And it was a great 2 years. I spent 2 years with Governor Huntsman. And then I went into the private sector because I thought, well, this is another opportunity for me to work on my skills. And I became really the Vice President of Government Affairs and Health, Safety, and the Environment within the mining space. And I did that for about 7 years. And again, had an opportunity to transition and come back to work for Governor Herbert. And this was kind of a surprise, too. I found myself at this point of transition looking at staying possibly in the mining sector. And I'll be candid, I mean, the private sector is a little more lucrative than the public sector, just a little bit. And so I sat down with my husband and my daughter, and I said, you know, I think I really want to pursue this job with Governor Herbert. I think that they've been looking for someone to fill this position for a while, and I feel like I've still got a lot to do. And so I went to Governor Herbert and the person who was his energy advisor at the time, and I said, you know, I'd really like this job. I know you've been looking for someone. And they said, Laura, that's really great, but you still have to apply. And so I thought, well, maybe they were just going to give it to me. And this was on a Friday, and applications had to be in on Monday. So I spent the weekend filling out, I think, 10 pages of essays, which I hadn't done in a number of years, about myself and my goals, and turned them in, and I interviewed and waited just like everyone else. And I was really honored and privileged when I was able to take on this role. Because I've been saying it for a long time, I think probably over 20 years now, that there's never been a more interesting and intriguing time to be involved in energy. And every year that I say it, it's more true than it was the year before. And the landscape is changing very, very quickly. And I say to anyone in this room, and to me, it is an opportunity to continue to learn. It's an opportunity to do, as Kathy said, ask questions, talk to each other, have conversations about what is our vision for the future, what is it that we want to create, and continue to work on creating things together. And even when we disagree, commit to having challenging conversations so that we can all be a little disruptive and affect, I think, outcomes for our future. So that's a little bit about my story. I didn't start when I was born, but I can next time if you want me to. I love what I do now. Our policy in Utah is really all of the above on energy, which in and of itself can be a challenging conversation because we support all forms of energy, fossil, unconventional resources that are of the fossil nature, as well as renewable energy, and also energy efficiency, because we believe that the full set of energy options provides resiliency, and you also never know where the next technological breakthrough is going to come from. And I will say, since 2008, we've reduced our greenhouse gases from electric utility generating facilities by 14% without mandates and by really focusing on an approach that drives efficiency and optimal outcomes. So, thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your pathways to where you are today. Because I'm somebody that can't follow a script, I'm going to warn you all, I'm not asking a question off the list to start with, but I'm using it as an opportunity to do something that Maury asked me to do. I'm a C3E ambassador, that's Clean Energy Education and Empowerment. It's a program that was set up under the Clean Energy Ministerial, and the U.S. participates in that program. You're going to hear a lot more about that. But one of the things that we have chosen to focus on here in the U.S. is the fact that often women are attracted into clean energy careers, but it's difficult to retain them, particularly at mid-career. And so with that as kind of the context, and to say that I have to say that when I was at mid-career in my role, I saw a number of women drop out of the workforce. While they used as their excuse the fact that they were dropping out to raise children, I know that in conversations it was because maybe they felt underutilized, or they didn't have a clear path forward in their career, or they felt isolated in the workplace and the culture wasn't a good fit, a whole variety of reasons. So my first question, and I'll start with you, Laura, maybe any observations or maybe a personal experience that you've had, and what was the catalyst that helped perhaps turn things around to retain talented women or yourself in your career?
Well, because I pursued an advanced degree in economics, and at the time, I mean, I think there were 2 women in my class of 12, and you know, often I would go to conferences or even, you know, into interviews, and there were very, very few women. I think that the real trigger for me was that I had a male professor who actually told me I wasn't a critical thinker. And as painful as that was, I said, listen, I understand the context of what is now, but I don't have to accept that as what is. So instead of accepting that as a truth, I went and I said, what is it that you think is a critical thinker, and how do I demonstrate that to you? And through a conversation and being very direct, you know, by having a very direct and specific conversation, we came to understand that we had the same notion about what it meant to be a critical thinker. So, so I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but you know, the challenge is that I think whether it's men or women, we all see the world differently. And what I really have come to learn and appreciate is the value of a conversation, and to be willing to be engaged, to listen, even if you disagree, because you will find that you may move on a different path, or the other person might move on a different path, but ultimately you're going to grow and find new opportunities.
Thank you. Kathy, any mid-career observations, catalyzing events that helped either keep you in the workforce or your peers?
Yeah. I think that, like anyone, when you start to feel very comfortable, that comfort has a tendency to either make you become complacent or seek something more. And I think personally I had both, maybe at the same time, where I said, you know, I've been doing this a long time, and maybe I should look at doing something else. And internally, you know, we have succession planning processes and things, and you know, leadership is sort of pinpointed, you know, particular positions and things like that. But at the same time, you know, if I were asked if you could have any job in the company, what would you take? I had a really hard time trying to identify, like, what is it that I would want to do? Would I want to, you know, be based in Washington, D.C. and be more on the political side? And I really went through that level of self-analysis and awareness and said, you know, I was there before and I wasn't very happy. So, you know, unless things have changed, which I didn't think they had, that wasn't the right move either. So what I started to do was take on more things myself. When somebody said, well, you know, we have this opportunity and it's sort of, well, we could send somebody from finance to do this, or is there any other volunteer? I was like, me? Because it let me explore other areas outside of where my comfort zone was to get to that point where you didn't become complacent. You started to look at things from a different perspective. So I think that, you know, whether it's women or men, we all get to that point in our careers where we've been someplace for a long time, that has a tendency to happen. And there's nothing wrong with challenging yourself, and there's nothing wrong with moving on either. You know, I look at some of the women in my organization who have very similar backgrounds to me, and I look for opportunities for them too, to continue to challenge themselves and see if there are other fits. I never want to put anybody in our organization in a position where they feel like they're somehow abandoning you or the company by taking a better opportunity. Because, you know, they should never pass that up. If they think it's a right fit and a good opportunity, go for it.
Amy, I'm going to switch gears and ask you, did you have to do things differently than your male counterparts as you were moving through your careers in any way?
I don't really think I had to do things differently. I think I did do things differently because I am a woman, and maybe have a different perspective on things. But I think you can be equally successful in energy and engineering as a man or a woman. I might have gone into management sooner than some of my male counterparts because of, you know, perhaps better listening or communication skills. But I think you need to do the same things. You need to find mentors, and you need to find them whether they are men or women. You need to ask questions, and you need to be open to opportunity. Something that maybe I had to do differently, I had maternity leave, right? I had 2 children, and you need to be open about that and what your expectations are when, you know, how much time you're going to take off and what you're going to do when you come back. I came back to work part-time both times. Because that was important to me to be able to have some sort of balance in my life. I also had to have different expectations as to how clean my house would be and things like that. And you need to, as a woman, sometimes you feel the need to be the super mom, et cetera, and you just got to let that go and rely on your spouse and have them pick up some of the other areas. And if the kids aren't getting bathed exactly the way you want them to be bathed, that's fine, you know, it's happening. So I see that, you know, mid-career women who have had children and can't kind of let go with that, and things have to be done a certain way, that sometimes holds us back.
Thank you. Just to share something with you, when I had my first child, I was afraid not to come back to work right away and come back full time. That was a life lesson for me, and one that now, when I see young women going out on leave for the first time, I encourage them not to come back as quickly as they might be thinking. You know, I regret to this day, but it was my own perceptions that were operating. It wasn't anything else. And in fact, I think oftentimes we operate on perceptions as women. I'm all about facts and data now. So, I just encourage people to take the time with their children and not get overwhelmed by the workplace. I am the most tenured person on this panel, so it was a little bit of a different day back then. I'm going to share with you a little bit of a story because it was the first time I stood up for myself, and it was extremely painful. And I can still, because it was an emotional event, I can still picture sitting across the desk from my boss with a male peer, and we were talking about a project that we had all been working on bringing into the laboratory. And the manager said, "Which one of you wants to manage this project?" And I can remember freezing at that moment. And then I heard the words come out of my mouth that said, "I want to manage it." And then I wanted to take those words back. And I thought I had just committed the worst crime on the planet. And why is that? Because in the back of my head, I could hear my mother's voice. And it was about when somebody puts a slice of cake or a couple slices of cake in front of you, you never take the big slice. And that was what was operating in the back of my head. But you have to advocate for yourself. You have to let people know what you want to do. You have to verbalize that. You have to be able to take that risk. And that was the first time I did. And I had an opportunity that I wouldn't have had if I sat back and didn't take that or communicate that. Now, he could have said, "No, I don't want you to." That's also a response. But if you don't communicate and let people know what your druthers are, then you won't probably get what you want. Okay. How does the clean energy transition look different when women are at the table? We've talked a little bit about, throughout all of our panelists, a little bit about it's not necessarily the technical skills. Those are the calling card, the foundation that get you into a career. But it may be some of the other skills that become more important in the workplace. How do you see that, Kathy? Maybe start with you on that question. When women are at the table, is it different, and how is it different?
Ideally, I'm not sure what the right answer is. Is it different? Yes. Do we all put our pants on the same way? I think so. But I think it really comes down to perspectives and experiences, and what I find really interesting among us up here is we all have had children, and I think that is one of the most transformative events that ever happens in anyone's life, because I can tell you that being a parent, being a mother, having a responsibility for 2 children completely changed my perspective at work. And there are times, honestly, when I think, boy, it's a good thing I had that experience, because these people in this room are acting like a bunch of children, and somebody needs to take charge. So sometimes it's, you bring those experiences with you and you apply them, and so diversity, what I'm really trying to get at here, I think, is diversity in experience brings diversity to the workplace and is a helpful thing, and I think challenges people a little bit more in the grand scheme of things.
Laura, would you like to comment on that as well?
Sure, but I think Kathy just said it perfectly. I really think it's about diversity. As I mentioned, when I was in graduate school and even as I entered my career, I was often the only woman in the room. There were many meetings where that was the case. And, one thing I've noticed is sometimes it's difficult for women to speak up if they're the only one in the room. And so I really had to make myself do that. And so I think that as we see more women showing up in the boardroom, in the C-suite, we'll call it, and really being at the table where I think key decisions are being made, and key decisions are made at every level of an organization, that they are absolutely bringing a different voice and a different willfulness to the conversation. And I have to say that, you know, a lot of it for me too was having a child, and I had a child very young and ultimately was a single parent. So I had to juggle parenting with building my career, and it meant that I had to also be incredibly well organized. And so I felt like that was a skill set which was unique and powerful for me. So I really began to embrace the fact that, you know, we all have our own stories. I have my own story, and I'm going to like it. I'm going to like my story, and so I think women bring a unique story to the table.
Great. I want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions at this point of any of the panel members. Who has a question? Or Maury, do you have questions that have come in?
Maybe somebody else?
Do I? Right back over here? We're equal opportunity. Go ahead.
Thank you. You've mentioned about asking quote unquote stupid questions, especially early in your career. I was curious, maybe what's a stupid question that you were afraid to ask, or that you think a lot of young professionals are afraid to ask but is very important?
Amy, do you have a thought on that one?
I think people are afraid to ask how things work, and appear like they don't know how things work, whether it's in a lab, what are the health and safety procedures. I see this with students coming in and working in our labs, and they don't want to be seen as, oh, I'm super health and safety conscious and I don't know what I'm doing. And they absolutely need to ask those questions so that they don't get hurt. Or is it on the political side when you're first working? How do we do things here, and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable? There's just things you really need to come out and ask about how things work and who makes decisions and those types of things that I see people kind of holding back and not wanting to admit that they don't know. So, and they're not stupid questions.
Thank you. Other questions? Right here in the red.
One of the things I've come to believe through my experience, my career, is that there's a real turning point in your career when you tell your boss no. When you flat out refuse to do something that, not I'll do it next week, but no, I think this is a dumb idea, I'm not going to do that. I was wondering if any of you had a different version of that would be different than my version.
I don't know that I've ever said, no, I won't do something, but it's more telling somebody that the way that they want to do something is not acceptable because it either, you know, conflicts with core principles or values or something like that. Because, you know, in any organization such as ours, you have internal goals, but you also have many external requirements, whether those are, you know, compliance with regulations, going through utility, economic regulation, et cetera. And people think that, you know, they're coming up with creative ideas, but sometimes they're just not, you know, sort of acceptable. And so I have many times told them, you know, that is not an acceptable approach. We're not going there. We're not going to say we're doing something when we're not. We're not going to greenwash. We're actually going to have facts, figures, statistics, so that we don't risk our credibility. And that is one of the biggest things in our organization is, you know, knowing that it takes up years and years to build credibility, but you can lose it in a second. And sometimes I have to remind people of that.
I also resonated with your question because I've often told myself that I'm a person that doesn't know how to say no, and we're a laboratory that doesn't know how to say no. We did say no once. And it was when we were given the opportunity to send some of our staff to Islamabad to work for a week And the conditions weren't safe. They would have had to ride in an armored vehicle from meeting to meeting outside the embassy compound. Safety, I find that's the number one reason to say no, and I say it no often, because if we're going to do something, we're going to do it right, and we're going to keep people safe. So that went all the way up the line in the Department of Energy, and we got a significant amount of pressure, but we kept our staff safe and we didn't go. Okay, other questions?
Bobby, I have a question here.
Is this on?
Did any of the panelists experience discouraging setbacks from people who didn't think their choice of their career was appropriate? And then how did you overcome it?
I'll just say that my freshman year in engineering, I was told by my fundamentals of engineering professor that women don't make good engineers. And I was like, what? This is 1982. And I couldn't believe it. And how did that change it? It just made me more determined to be one. And, I dug my heels in rather than turning around.
Good for you. I think my first point of being discouraged was my own family. There was never any question that my two sisters and I were going to go to college, but I was the first one actually to go as the youngest, which was a little unusual. But when I got the opportunity to pursue chemical engineering, the whole family kind of went crazy, and they said, that sounds like a really narrow field. We think you're making a big mistake. We don't think you should do that. Well, I didn't even know what chemical engineering was either, but being the rebel, it was kind of like, okay, I dug in my heels and said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And then I went and found out what it was. Fine. Other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you all for your leadership and being role models for women. And so my question actually stems from being a role model with the recent, advent of many women speaking out across the country relating to any kind of discrimination or harassment in the workplace. How else are you being role models for other women beyond being leaders in energy and energy transition to clean energy? Thank you.
Laura, do you want to kick that off?
Well, the biggest thing I say is get involved, and get involved in as many things as you can. In addition to energy, I'm very passionate about the arts, so I've sought opportunities to serve on boards. I have one child, I have a daughter. I've encouraged her to not be afraid to jump in, as you've heard from these panelists, where things scare you, where things are going to be difficult and challenging. And because I'm a mother, I have to brag, and I know her father does too. But she's getting a PhD in neuroscience now. And so I think that it really is, whether it's friends, it's family, it's children, encourage them to jump in. Encourage them to jump in, whether they're young men or they're young women, because that's really what it's all about. It's about doing something that's bigger than yourself. And when you get outside of just who you are and you look at what you can do and what you can create when you're part of something bigger, I think that's really where we can be leaders and we can, I think, cause change.
Thank you. Kathy, do you want to comment on that?
Well, Laura covered it extremely well, but I think that I'll give you a little bit of a story. So last week I was in Salt Lake City and I was riding on the light rail, and it comes down to, if you see something, say something, and it goes back to what is acceptable and what isn't. I think that, we all have an obligation. It doesn't matter who you are, what gender you are, what race you are, but we all have our own moral compass, but there are just things that are wrong, and you have to point out when things are wrong, because otherwise they get out of control. And we breed this society of acceptance of things that are not acceptable. So I go back to if you see something, say something.
Great, thank you. I'm watching the clock and I see we have 35 seconds left and counting. I'd like to have you join me in thanking all these panelists for sharing their careers and insights.